The book is out now. Have I read it? No, I have not. Have I looked into what it's about? No, I have not. Do I still want to read it? Yes, I do. Hello and welcome back, or welcome to my channel. If you are new here, we are back with another Mystic Readathon video. So this time around, if you saw the last video, then you saw that was a list of books that I recommend based on all of the prompts. This time I am taking those same prompts and I'm going to create my own hypothetical TBR. The reason why I say that it's hypothetical is because I am not participating in the readathon as just a regular player. As the creator, I am just going to kind of oversee everything. I don't think that it would be fair for me to choose a faction and participate in that way. So what I'm going to be doing instead is having you guys vote on what books I read, and based on what you guys vote for determines which team gets the points. Each week you guys will get 4 emojis. There will be a poll and you'll have to vote for one of the emojis. You will not know what book corresponds to which emoji. You also will not know which team is related to which emoji. You just have to vote purely on the emoji alone, and depending on what emoji wins determines what book gets read and which team that point goes to. So each of those emojis corresponds to a very specific book and a very specific team. So it is up to you guys to blindly vote and decide what team and what book that is going to be. But if I was going to be participating, here is a list of books that I would be reading based on these prompts. I do not own any of these physically, and I just had the list on my phone, so I'm just going to kind of go through quickly. I can't even really give you a description of what these books are about because I haven't read them, and I like to go into books as blind as possible. I choose books to put on my TBR based on what I have heard other people say about it, and it's one of those things where in the moment I'm listening to you, it sounds good, I tell myself add it to TBR, but if you ask me later why did you add that book to your TBR, I won't be able to tell you. I think it'll be pretty boring for me to sit through and read the synopses of all of these books. One, that would make this video super long, and two, I just feel like that would be boring and you guys could do that yourselves. So I'm just gonna go through and talk about the prompt and the book that I would read if I was reading for that prompt. And these could be recommendations for you as well. Again, same deal as last time. Some of these books, even though I may put it for a specific prompt for a specific team, this may be a book that could be applied to a different team for a completely different prompt. So going in the same order that I went in the last time, the first prompt up is a book written by a BIPOC author. And for this, I would choose Never Saw Me Coming by Vera Kurian. I'm not sure if I said that author's name right, but this is a book that I actually wanted to read a couple of weeks or months ago, back when Princess from the Castle, or what is her channel called now? Princess Does. She did that as one of her book club picks, and I desperately wanted to read that, but there was just so much going on at the time that I didn't get around to it. So if I was going to read a book just based on a BIPOC author, this would be the one that I would pick. The next prompt is for a book that is set in Georgia, and for this, I would read The Weight of Blood by Tiffany D. Jackson. This is a book that I have been hearing great things about for a couple of years at this point, and I definitely plan on reading it at some point. Maybe I'll get to it later this year. If not, I definitely want to get to it in 2025. My understanding is that this is a Carrie retelling or reimagining or something, but that's about all I know about it. Next is to read a book that is set in Virginia, and for this I would read Finlay Donovan. I haven't actually read any of the Finlay Donovan books, but from what I read online, I believe this book takes place somewhere in Virginia, so this is the book that I would pick for that prompt. I think this series starts off with Finlay Donovan talking to someone about something and someone overhearing that conversation and thinking that she's like a hitman or something, and then they hire her to like kill their husband or something like that. That's about all I know. The next prompt is to read a book with the word curse in the title, and for this I would go with A Curse So Dark and Lonely by Bridget Kemmerer. I think that's how you say the author's name. This is the first book in the Cursebreaker series. Again, have not read any of the books in this series, but the synopsis, from what I remember someone else when they were talking about it, it sounded interesting. Do I remember what they said? Absolutely not. Do I remember what this is about? Absolutely not. But it sounded good. It's on my TBR. It has curse in the title. So if I was going to read a book for this prompt, this is what I would pick. The next prompt is to read a book with an LGBTQ+ main character, and for this I would read Thirst by Mariana something. I have no idea how you pronounce this author's last name. I'm not even going to attempt and butcher it, so I will spare you that embarrassment, spare myself that embarrassment. But yeah, this is the book that I would read for that. I will be reading this. It won't be in September, but I will be reading this, and I will be doing a reading vlog for this, because in September I will also be starting a series where I read books that were recommended to me by members of the Vampire Diaries cast. And so this was a book that was recommended to me by one of the cast members from the show. So I will be reading this and vlogging it. It just won't be in September. The way it was described to me as like a vampire book, but it's also like sapphic. So it was recommended to me by someone whose opinion I value highly. So I can't wait to read this whenever I do get to it. I'm very excited to eventually read this. The next prompt is for the werewolves, and that is to read a book with a black cover. And for this, I would read Everything the Darkness Eats by Eric LaRocca. Don't know what this is about, but I know that I have this book. This is one of the few books on the list that I actually do own. Don't know where it is right now because I'm still in the process of unpacking my books, but I do own it somewhere in this house. And yeah, I've had it on my shelf probably since last year, and I just haven't read it yet. Eric LaRocca is a pretty well-known horror writer. Have I read any of his books? No. Do I own like 3 or 4 of them? Yes. Next up is for the vampires, and that is a prompt to read a book with a red cover. And for this, I would read Daughter of No Worlds by Carissa Broadbent. Now, I don't know anything about this, but I know that Katie from I Would Rather Be Reading, who was one of the vampire faction leaders, swears by this book. She loves this book. I'm pretty sure this is her host favorite for the readathon. So this is what I would be reading. I hear great things about it. I also hear great things about this author's writing just in general, like other books that this author has written. I think this is the same author as Serpent and the Wings of Night. Don't quote me on that, but I think it's the same author. So yeah, I just hear great things about this author's books. And so that is why that is the book that I would pick if I had to read a book with a red cover. The next prompt is for the witches, and that is to read a book with a green cover. And for this, I would read A Song of Wraiths and Ruin by, is it Roseanne A. Brown? Yeah. So I don't know anything about this series. A couple months ago, maybe like last year or so, this was making its round on like booktube and stuff. And so I do want to read this. I think the cover looks really cool. And yeah, I hear people who I value their opinion when it comes to fantasy books speak highly of this. So I definitely want to read this at some point. So yeah, if I had to read a book with a green cover, this is the one that I would be picking. Next up is a prompt for the humans, and that is to read a book with a blue cover. And for this, I would be reading First Lie Wins by Ashley Elston. Don't know anything about this book. I know that it was book of the month at one point, and it was making its rounds. I see that a lot of people either have read it or are currently reading it, and it seems to be pretty popular. I don't hear a ton of negative reviews about this book. I know that it's like a thriller. That's pretty much all I know. This, just like Thirst, is another book that was also recommended to me by one of the cast members of the show, and so I will be reading and vlogging this at some point. It just won't be in September. The next prompt is for the vampires, and that is to read a book that starts with the letter V. And for this, I would read The Villain Edit by Laurie Devore, I think is how you say the author's last name. I'm not entirely sure if that's really how you say it. I was gonna say Devereaux, but that's because I got too much Vampire Diaries universe happening in my brain, and I was thinking about Sophie Devereaux, but I think it's Devore. Let's hope that that's how you say it. If it's not, I'm so sorry. But my understanding for this book is that this follows a main character who goes to be on a reality show. And then when the show gets edited, she gets edited to look like the villain in the series. And I guess it's just her experience with that. And so I thought this was a really fun like premise, because I love trash reality TV. Like I'm a big fan of all those dating shows and stuff, you know, Love is Blind, Too Hot to Handle, like all those shows. And there's always a villain, right? There's always a character that you love to hate. And so I think getting the behind the scenes of seeing what it's like to be that person who gets edited to be the villain, I think that that is going to be such a fun story to follow. So that is why that would be my #1 pick for a book that starts with a V. Next up is a prompt for the humans, and that is to read a book that starts with the letter H. And for this, I would read Horror Movie by Paul Tremblay. Now, I've never read anything from this author. In fact, I didn't even know who this author was until Rainy from Rainy Blue Reads, who was also one of our faction leaders for the werewolf team. She read one of his books, I think last year, and she did not enjoy it. And so I'm a little bit nervous going into this book, but from what I remember the premise being, which I don't remember what it is now, but I remember like reading the premise and being like, oh, this sounds really interesting. Actually, did I read the premise for this? I think there was like a trailer or something on Instagram that I saw, like a reel or something that was talking about this book. And I was like, ooh, okay, I need to read this now. But at the time that that came out, it was before the book actually released. And so the book is out now. Have I read it? No, I have not. Have I looked into what it's about? No, I have not. Do I still want to read it? Yes, I do. Next up is a prompt for the werewolves, and it is to read a book that starts with the letter W. So for this, I would read The White Guy Dies First. This is another horror anthology that is written by a bunch of authors of color. Again, some pretty well-known names. And so this is a book that I probably actually will read in September if I have time. I do want to try to fit this in because it just sounds like it's going to be a good time. It reminds me, like, it's the same kind of vibe of like Out There Screaming, which is another horror anthology that is written, a bunch of stories that are written by authors of color. And the fact that I enjoyed that as much as I did, I definitely want to pick up another one. And just the title of this book is just so like intriguing. Like I have to know, I have to read the stories that are in this book with that kind of title. I need need to read this. So hopefully I am actually able to get to this in September, but we'll see. Before we move on to the next prompt, take a second to like this video if you are enjoying it, give it a thumbs up, and also subscribe if you are not already subscribed. That way you don't miss a video. And now on to the next prompt. The next book is kind of ironic because it is a prompt for the vampires, and it is the prompt to read a book with blood on the cover or in the title. But this book was actually a book that was recommended to me by the witch faction leader, Paco, and it is This Ravenous Fate by Haley Dennings. It says that it is a romantic fantasy set in Jazz Age Harlem, which sounds really interesting. The last book recommendation that I got from Paco was Blood Debts, and I loved that. So I will continue to read books that are recommended to me by Paco because he seems to know my taste very well. Very excited to read this. Will I get to this in September? Probably not, but it is definitely on my TBR, and so if I had to read a book with blood on the cover, this is what I will be reading. The next prompt is for the humans, and that is to read a book with a name in the title, and for this I will be reading Daisy Darker by Alice Feeney. This is another author that I have never read anything from, but I actually want to read quite a few books on this author's backlist, and this just so happens to be one of them, and it has a name in the title. So do I remember what this book is about? No. I remember when this book came out. Like, was it last year or the year before when it came out? And I remember like lots of people were talking about it. I feel like the hype around this book has definitely died down. And I don't know if there was a lot, sometimes there's a lot of hype around books before they come out and then people actually read it and they're like, oh, it actually wasn't that good. And then, you know, I don't know, sometimes things just get hyped up because TikTok. So I don't really know why the hype around this book died down, but I definitely have not heard very many people talk about this book in like recent months. So I do still want to read it. I remember that when people were talking about it, it sounded like a book that I would very much enjoy. So it is on my hypothetical TBR for September. Next up is for the witches, and that is to read a book with fire or candles on the cover. And for this, I would actually read Divergent. Divergent is a very popular series that I have never read the books for and have never seen the movies for. So if I was going to have to read a book with fire on the cover or like candles or whatever on the cover, this is the book that I would read because it would force me to finally read this series and know what it's about. Like, I don't even really know what it's about. I hear a lot of other book series get compared to Divergent all the time, but I never understand the reference because I've never read the books and I've never seen the movies. So this would be the perfect excuse if I had to do this prompt to finally read the Divergent series. The next prompt is for the humans, and it is to read a book with like letters, text messages, journal entries, something along those lines in it. And for this, I would be reading Where Sleeping Girls Lie by an author whose name I'm not going to attempt to pronounce in an effort not to butcher it and embarrass myself. But this is another book that I believe Princess read for one of her book club picks that I missed because the last 6 months have been very chaotic in my life. And so I just didn't get around to it, but I definitely want to read this. The premise of this sounded really good. I think there's like a murder that happens at like a boarding school or like some kind of academy. And I don't really know much else besides that. Like, you had me at murder. So that's really all I needed to know. This is also the author that wrote Ace of Spades. And that was a very interesting book. It was giving like Get Out meets Gossip Girl vibes. It was like if the writers of Gossip Girl and like Jordan Peele got together and made a book, like that's kind of what it was giving, but it was YA. So like also keep that in mind. But yeah, I would read another book by this author. I had a good enough experience with Ace of Spades that I would read another book by this author. And so this is what I would pick for a book that has, I believe Princess said that this book has text messages in it. So assuming that that's correct, then this is the book that I would pick for that prompt. The next prompt is again for the vampires, and it is to read a book with vampires. And for this, I would read The Beautiful by Renee Ahdieh, I think is how you say the author's last name. And I don't really know anything about this book or this series other than the fact that it has vampires in it. So again, this would be the perfect opportunity if I was going to have to read a book for this prompt to finally pick up this series and read it. The only thing I really know about this story is that I believe it's like a historical fiction fantasy that takes place in like the 1800s in New Orleans, I think. And this just sounded great because it's very much giving like the originals, which is also historical like fiction fantasy that takes place in New Orleans. I mean, it's not just historical. There's obviously a present day storyline, but there are a lot of flashbacks too. So this just felt very like reminiscent of that. And so I do think this would be a fun series to pick up just based on what I've heard other people say about it and how much other people have enjoyed it. So if I was going to read a book that had to have vampires in it during the Mystic Readathon, which is Vampire Diaries universe inspired, then this is definitely the one that I would pick up because it's giving originals. The next prompt is for the witches, and that is to read a book with witches. And for this, I would be reading Blood Like Magic by Lascelle. Is it Samberry? Yeah. So this is the book that I would pick up for this. I have been wanting to read this book for so long, and I just life just happens, right? And so you always have the best intentions to pick up all these different books, and you can only read but so much in a month and in a year, and so things just kind of get lost in the shuffle. And so this is a book that I have been meaning to read for so long and just haven't gotten around to it. I don't know that I've ever seen anybody give a negative review about this. Again, I'm not saying that it's not out there. I'm sure somebody disliked it somewhere in the world. But I think more often than not, the reviews that I have seen for this book have been overwhelmingly positive. And so that is another reason why I definitely want to pick this up, because I am excited to read about Black witches. And then the last and final book for this list is for the werewolves, and it is the prompt to read a book with shapeshifters. And for this, I would read Shiver. And this is by Maggie something. Again, I'm not going to attempt to pronounce this author's last name and butcher it, but this is a book that I would read for this. Don't really know anything about it, to be quite honest, but I know that this follows two characters. I think it's Grace, and I don't know what the guy's name is, but the guy is a shapeshifter. He turns into a wolf, but I think his turning or his shifting has something to do with like the weather. So like when it gets cold, he turns into a wolf or something like that. And so there's a romance obviously that builds between them. And then the stakes are he has to figure out how to stay human, because if he, I guess, reverts back to a werewolf, then he's going to lose his love interest, which is Grace. I don't exactly know why he would lose his love interest, but I guess you would find out by reading this book. I feel like anytime I ask someone for a recommendation for a werewolf book, this book always ends up on the list. So it's pretty popular. I don't know if people necessarily like it, but it's pretty well known, and I keep seeing it and hearing about it anytime that conversation comes up of asking for recommendations for werewolf books. So I am interested to see what the hype is about and why this book is so well known and talked about and recommended all the time. So this is the book that I would pick for a shapeshifter book. And there you have it. Those are all of the books on my hypothetical TBR for the Mystic Readathon. Let me know down below if any of these books made it onto your TBR, or if after watching this video, you plan on adding any of these books to your TBR. If you are not already signed up for the Readathon, the information is down below in the description, so you can check out the actual announcement video as well as the sign up form and the link to the Discord. Like I said earlier, I will not actually be reading many of these books during the month of September, because you guys will get to vote on what I read. So make sure that you are locked into that Discord so that you don't miss any announcement that pertain to the polls. The polls will likely be happening on my Instagram, but I will be notifying you of when the polls go up on the Discord. If you made it this far into the video, drop the name of a cast member whose recommendations you think I'll be reading in September. I'll give you a hint. There are 4 cast members whose recommendations I will be reading next month. So let me know who you think one of them might be. And with that, I will send you guys on your way to finish creating your TBRs or your list of hopefuls, and I will see you guys somewhere else on the internet. Bye.